All right, hello everyone. How is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we've been focusing on doing Bible decodes for the last several months. This is number 293, and this channel in general focuses on important and impactful theories, discoveries, and concepts that you probably haven't heard of before because they've been suppressed out of your purview, things that you need to know but you don't know because somebody amongst the powers that be is skirting the information off to the margins where you have to dig and dig and dig to get in touch with it. And there's a lot of stuff like that for the Bible. We've looked a lot at the Roman origins hypothesis of the Bible, where that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. And we've exhaustively gone over the evidence in favor and against that theory. We've also examined the Dead Sea Scrolls, not quite in so much detail, but we've gone over kind of the repression of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were a lot of Catholic priests out there who didn't want you to know what they said. And even though they were tasked with the responsibility of translating these documents that were originally in Hebrew, they never really did. And for 40 years, they just kind of kicked the can down the road, and an entire, probably 2 generations of Bible scholars were unable to examine these documents because these Dominican priests hoarded them and wouldn't release them to the public until legal action was taken. So that's kind of how these things go within the church. And now we're looking at a book written way back in 1881 that discusses another thing about the Bible that is suppressed by various parties for various reasons, but generally they want you to read the Bible, but they don't really want you to know what the Bible is. You're supposed to kind of read it as if it's the Word of God. And just to me, that's not going to cut it. You can tell me that the Bible is the Word of God, but I believe in the truth. And the truth is not going to settle for that answer. I'm not saying that the Bible isn't the Word of God. I'm just saying that that is not a sufficient answer for me. I need some evidence. I need something that's other than faith that is going to, because faith and truth are not compatible necessarily. They can be, but there is no link between them. Basically, when you have faith in something, that pretty much means that you do not know. And I'm trying to know these things with some level of something I can point to, and that's really a supernatural description that I'm only going to accept if there is nothing else. It's just like Occam's razor, or your basic understanding that even most Christians would accept, that you don't resort to supernatural explanations when there are perfectly natural explanations for the same thing. The only time that you're really, you know, justified in resorting to supernatural explanations is if there is no other explanation. And so we're looking here at a book by Bronson Keeler that's called History of the Bible. This is a book that has a history. It didn't just get spun down from on high and placed into your lap for you to read it. It was the work of human beings putting it together, and it has a long history, a long and sordid history. And if you can understand, you know, who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, what language was it written in, and so on and so forth, then you might be able to, and like what was at stake, you know, what were the agendas involved, then you can, you know, have a fighting chance to actually understand the Bible when you do read it. Now, Christians in many cases can't answer some of the most basic questions. A lot of Christians don't recognize, don't realize that the New Testament of the Bible was originally written in Greek. That should be a red flag to you, because the people who were said to have written the New Testament spoke Aramaic, and very, very few of them would have been versed in Greek, even setting aside the fact that almost all of them were illiterate, you know, reading or writing in even Aramaic, much less Greek, whereas Greek was pretty much most of the Roman royalty spoke and wrote in both Greek and Latin. Another thing is, what language were the Ten Commandments written on? Because Hebrew was not said to have really come around until maybe the 10th century BC. And so when Moses is bringing down the Ten Commandments, what language is it in? Nobody knows. Somebody tell me. But now we're getting back to the Keeler here, and he was just talking about kind of like all of the other books. The word they use is apocryphal, which is supposed to mean spurious. That there are all kinds of books that are not in the Bible, but that kind of have the same subject matter as the Bible. Why have these books been, why have these particular, like, 4 Gospels been chosen, and all the rest of them, all the rest of the Gospels, because there are dozens of other Gospels, why have they not been chosen? And who chose them? And when did they choose them? And in some cases, some of these books, you know, were seen as being canon material at one point, but then they were not seen in a later era of being worthy of being in the canon. You know, he points out in last episode that the people back then, a few centuries after the supposed existence of Jesus, they didn't see things as divinely inspired. They didn't see any of these books as being really divinely inspired, and they felt like they could insert their editorial comments and lop off portions of the text if they felt it was the right thing to do. And they did it without any type of shame or secrecy. They just, you know, that's just kind of the mentality of the age. Okay, Now, I swear I had my my place marked, but I seem to. Okay, here we go. So here's we're going to start up here. We're in chapter 2. No, chapter 3, which I believe is related to kind of the New Testament canon, formation of the New Testament canon. The following is a partial list of the books fabricated and in circulation in that age. Now, when he says in that age, I believe he's referring to mainly like late second and third century. In addition to the ones now in the New Testament, those in italics are preserved in the apocryphal New Testament, and those in Roman letters are no longer extant. Okay, so some of these books that we're about to read the titles of, they exist as apocrypha. Some exist only, they do not exist anymore, but they do, we know of them because they're referred to by other books that we do know. Okay, the Gospel of Paul, the Gospel of Peter, the first epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, St. Ignatius's epistle to the Romans, his epistle to the Ephesians, and his epistle to Polycarp. Now, keep in mind that according to the Roman origins hypothesis, St. Ignatius was a pen name of Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman court member, very close to the emperors, especially the Flavian emperors in the late 1st, early 2nd century. And he is one that at least Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin identify as being Paul and having written the epistles that are attributed to Paul, along with a couple of the other members of the Piso family, younger members. So it's no surprise here that Ignatius has also epistle to the Romans, epistle to the Ephesians, and epistle to Polycarp, just like he has the epistle to the Romans and epistle to the Ephesians under the name of Paul as well. It'd be very interesting to check out the similarities and differences between those two, especially the Romans and the Ephesians. Anyway, back to the list of the books that existed in this age. The Gospel according to the Egyptians, the Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians, the Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs, the Sibylline Oracles, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, the Gospel of Perfection, the Gospel of Philip, another Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, the Gospel of Basilides, the Gospel of Thaddeus, the first Gospel of the infancy of Jesus Christ, which I've read, which is super, it's like a nursery rhyme. But it does show how Jesus, even when he was a little kid, was putting curses on people. And I believe he ended up killing somebody and then bringing him back to life. So anyway, the Gospel of the birth of Mary, the Gospel of Scythianus, the Gospel of Tatian, the Gospel of Life, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Andrew, the Gospel of Bartholomew, the Gospel of Eve, the Gospel of the Encratites, the false Gospels of Hezekiah, Hesychius, the Gospel of Jude, the false Gospels published by Lucianus, the Gospel of Barnabas, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Peter and Andrew, the Acts of John, the Acts of Mary, the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of the Apostles made use of by the Ebionites, the Acts of the Apostles by Lucius, the Acts of the Apostles used by the Manichaeans, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the preaching of Paul, the preaching of Peter, the doctrine of Peter, the Acts of Philip, the Acts of Thomas, the Acts of Barnabas, the judgment of Peter, an epistle of Christ to Peter and Paul, an epistle of Christ produced by the Manichaeans. Now, these last 10 or so that I've read are all apparently still unavailable at this point. They don't exist anymore, as far as we know. The epistle of Themison, the epistles of Paul to Seneca, which I know that one is a forgery. Now Seneca the Younger, was one that Roman Piso claims is one of the original conspirators for the Roman origins hypothesis. He was one of the original writers of what he called Ur Marcus, or like Proto-Mark, that was kind of a rough draft for what the Romans eventually put together as the Gospel of Mark, and then eventually Matthew and Luke. Now Seneca presented his idea along with Lucius Piso to Emperor Nero in the 50s or early 60s AD, and proposed, that, the Jews are getting very militant and aggressive, and, they're insurrecting and revolting, and we can use this gospel in order to kind of mellow them out by presenting them with a Prince of Peace instead of a military Messiah. And Emperor Nero didn't go for it, because Emperor Nero was married to this woman, Poppaea, and she was very, very sympathetic to the Jews and didn't want that to happen. So Nero rejected their idea, and so Seneca, who had originally, when Nero was a child, Seneca was his tutor. But Seneca and Roman Piso plotted to assassinate Nero, and they got found out, and Nero caught them for conspiring against him, and he had Seneca executed along with one of the Pisos in 65 AD. Now, this epistle of Paul to Seneca is a forgery that I'm racking my brain to try to remember how it was demonstrated that it was a forgery. But apparently there's also the epistles of Seneca to Paul. So there's the epistles of Paul to Seneca and the epistles of Seneca to Paul. The revelation of Peter, the revelation of Paul, the revelation of Bartholomew, the revelation of Cerinthus, the revelation of Stephen, the revelation of Thomas, the revelation of Moses, the revelation of Esdras, the Protevangelion or Gospel of James, Thomas's Gospel of the infancy of Jesus Christ, the Acts of Pilate, or the Gospel of Nicodemus, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistle to the Magnesians, the Epistle to the Trallians, the Epistle to the Smyrnians, the Epistle to the Philadelphians, or the Philadelphians. And in parentheses it says forgeries under the name of Ignatius. And then the Epistle to the Laodiceans, forgery under the name of Paul. The Pastor of Hermas, the Gospel of Cerinthus, the Gospel of Marcion, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Apelles, second epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, the Gospel of Longinus, an epistle of Jesus Christ to Agabus, king of Edessa, who Ralph Ellis claims is the true Jesus Christ, the historical Jesus Christ, King Isas of Edessa, and an epistle of Agabus to Jesus Christ. Now, if you are a Christian and you've read your Bible, ask yourself why you're not in the least bit curious of all of these other books that all talk about Jesus and his disciples and the life that they lived in Judea at this time period, and the troubles that they faced, and the adventures that they went through, and the miracles that occurred. Why are you content to just stick with the 4 Gospels and the 1 book of Acts and the 1 book of Revelation that has been presented to you in the New Testament, and you're not in the least bit curious about the other 20 books of Acts and the other 20 Gospels and the several revelations of all kinds of different other people? Why are those things, why have you never, not much less, you haven't read these books, but you also haven't even heard of these books before? Wouldn't you think that a more circumspect approach would be to have read all of these and determine for yourself what you think is legitimate and what isn't? But in most cases, the Christians have just accepted the 4 Gospels, the 1 book of Acts, and the 1 book of Revelation that is given to them from seemingly on high, and that the rest of this stuff, I don't need to know that. This is not relevant to me because somebody has told me that it's false or a forgery or that it's destructive or something. So these are just the questions I'm not saying that these things are legitimate. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that shouldn't you determine that for yourself, as opposed to having somebody tell you that, oh, don't read that. That's not part of the canon. You only want to read things that are part of the canon. This Bible here, this is what has come down to us throughout history of the most important and most true books that have been written. Whose word are you taking for that? You're taking the word of a bunch of, priests, Catholic priests most likely, the same people who covered up the Dead Sea Scrolls and didn't show it to you for 40 years, and would have never shown it to you unless legal action was taken against them. Okay, back to Keeler here. These are not all the books of that time. Of many, we have not even the names. I have mentioned, for example, but 13 books of Acts, whereas Fabricius made a collection of 36 books of Acts. It was from such forgery and falsification as this, with its Gospel of Judas Iscariot, Gospel of Eve, and epistles ascribed to Jesus, that our 4 Gospels, which are themselves forgery and but a part of the common stream, came. Most of the books of that age were written to uphold or oppose particular doctrines, as when our Gospel of John is said to have been indicted to refute the views of Cerinthus and the Nicolaitans. Paul had to warn the Thessalonians not to be troubled or misled by letters falsely purporting to be from him, and cautioned them that every genuine letter would bear his signature. Now, in Thessalonians, where Paul does do that, where he warns his followers not to be misled by false letters, that book of Thessalonians has been shown to be a fraud also. So in a fraudulent book, it's warning you to not be misled by fraudulent books. That's what we're dealing with here. Please don't indicate that there's something sacrosanct here. This is one level of fraud piled upon another. While there was a great number of sects, three principal ones command the attention of the student: the Paulines, the Petrines, and the Johannines, or the followers of Paul, of Peter, and of John, a division which is maintained in a measure to this day. The Eastern or Greek church preferred John, and the Western, Peter. Now, so remember, the Catholic Church was basically split in two. You had the Eastern and Western, and the Western was centered on Rome, and the Eastern was centered at Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople or Istanbul in Turkey. And they had different popes, I believe they had different popes, and a whole different orthodoxy. And then I believe that the Eastern Church then led to the Eastern Orthodox churches of some of those Eastern European countries, like Russia. And I could be wrong about that. And so the Eastern Church preferred to follow John and the book of John, and the Western Church followed with Peter, who was the first pope, or Bishop of Rome, and then Paul kind of was given to the Protestants, if I'm not mistaken. So, okay, the Eastern or Greek Church preferred John and the Western Peter. The latter divided at the time of the Reformation, and the Roman Catholic body maintained the authority of Peter as the only lawful head, while the Protestants now follow Paul. The doctrines which Protestant clergymen preach so much, predestination, foreordination, sanctification, and similar ones, are Paulisms, Jesus never having taught them. Yeah, I have huge problems with Paul, because Paul never even met Jesus except for in a swoon that he was having, and just kind of made stuff up as he went along. Now, his doctrine was probably more modern, because he wanted to bring the Gentiles into the fold, and so he ended up lopping off a lot of the Jewish traditions: circumcision, animal sacrifice, Saturday Sabbath, and so on, kosher food laws. But where is he getting that from? If you can entertain the Roman origins hypothesis, it starts to make a lot more sense. That all of this is nonsense, it's all fiction, and it's all part of a psychological operation that the Romans used against the Jews to mellow them out and make them less aggressive. And it's still working today, but most of it has been passed on to the Gentiles, which the Romans were intending to also pacify the Gentiles, the slaves in the Roman Empire, as well as the soldiers, who they were concerned that soldiers were going to be demanding more pay. That's why in the Gospels it talks about, Jesus tells the soldiers to be satisfied with their pay their taxes, recognize that Paul tells them to recognize that Caesar was, a representative of God. Okay, the contest between Peter and Paul raged fiercely in the early days immediately following Jesus, and each was vigorously supported by factions. Paul was the apostle of uncircumcision and of the Gentiles. Peter of circumcision and of the Jews. Paul, now maybe, but in the long run, the Catholics never had circumcision. So what happened there? But anyway, Paul wished to carry Christ to the Gentiles and still allow them to be Gentiles. Peter said if they become Christians, they must also become Jews, be circumcised, and do as the Jews did in the ceremonial. In those days, Paul was not recognized as a lawful teacher of Christianity, nor was he for more than 100 years. In these days, if Peter should come back to earth and advocate circumcision, the strangulation of bullocks, and the strict observance of the Jewish ceremonial, he would not be permitted to preach in any Christian church, Catholic or Protestant. People do not realize how far from primitive Christianity they have gone. Paul said, if anyone, even an angel from heaven, preached any other gospel than he did, that person should be accursed. He claimed authority as an apostle equal to that of the apostles at Jerusalem, but they had been appointed by the master in person, or 11 of them had been, and they had elected a 12th to fill the place of Judas, Peter superintending the process, while Paul had appointed himself, and for him to claim to be their equal was something to which they could not submit. Paul asked, am I not an apostle? And the other said he was not. Revelation, which is from John, therefore anti-Pauline, according to this author, says, referring to Paul, quote, and thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars. Paul claimed that he and his followers were still Jews, even if they did not practice circumcision. But Peter and his friends denied it, and Revelation, again thrusting at Paul, says, quote, I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan, and them of the synagogue